Hello everyone, my name is Oscar Rodriguez and this is screencast assignment number 1 for CIS 307 section 3. So let's begin. So some of the database concepts being covered in this video are entities, attributes, business rules, and relationship types. Let's first start out with these 4 types of entities by defining them one by one. An entity is a person, place, an object, an event, or a concept in the user environment about which the organization wishes to maintain data. An entity type is a collection of entities that share common properties or characteristics. An entity instance is a single occurrence of an entity type, and a weak entity is dependent on a strong entity and cannot exist on its own and does not have a unique identifier. Let's see an example. So in this example, we can clearly see that we have our entity, which is an employee, which is also a person. We have the entity type here, which is the employee. We have an attribute, which is the employee ID number, and we have the entity instance, which we just made up and is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. And in our second example, we see here that we have a weak entity that is dependent on a strong entity, with which the strong entity is the employee and the employee ID number, and the weak entity being dependent and the dependent name. Now let's go over and define some attributes. An attribute is defined as a property or characteristic of an entity or relationship type that is of interest to the organization. A required attribute is an attribute that must have a value for every entity instance with which it is associated. An optional attribute is an attribute that may not have a value for every entity instance with which it is associated. A composite attribute is an attribute that has meaningful component parts. An identifier attribute is an attribute whose value distinguishes instances of an entity type. Multi-valued attribute is an attribute that may take on more than one value for a given entity instance. And derived attribute is an attribute whose values can be calculated from related attribute values. Now let's see an example. In this example, we see 3 attributes, of which 2 are required and the other being optional. The attributes listed are employee ID number, name, and religion. The first 2 attributes, employee ID number and name, are clearly required, and the instances given for them here and here. The last attribute, religion, is optional, and its instance is located here. In this example, we have a few more attributes. So the identifier attribute is listed as employee ID, and as we see here, employee ID is bolded and underlined. The composite attribute is listed as the employee's name, which is made up of its first and last name. Multi-valued attribute is listed as a skill and is in these funny little brackets here. The derived attribute is listed as years employed and is listed in these block brackets. And the optional attribute, which we said before, was religion. Now let's go over some business rules. We define business rule as a statement that defines or constrains some aspect of the business. It is intended to assert business structure or to control or influence the behavior of the business. They are derived from policies, procedures, events, or functions. Good business rules are declarative, precise, atomic, consistent, expressible, distinct, and business-oriented. Now let's go over some relationship types. Our book defines relationship type as a meaningful association between or among entity types. Relationship instance is an association between entity instances where each relationship instance associates exactly one entity instance from each participating entity type. We have 3 degrees of relationships. the number of entity types that participate in a relationship, and they are unary, binary, and ternary. Unary is defined as a relationship between instances of a single entity type. Binary is defined as a relationship between the instances of two entity types, and ternary is a simultaneous relationship among the instances of three entity types. We also have cardinality constraints. They are a rule that specifies the number of instances of one entity that can be associated with each instance of another entity. The constraints are either minimum or maximum. The minimum number of instances of one entity that may be associated with each instance of another entity is the minimum constraint, and the maximum number of instances of one entity that may be associated with each instance of another entity is the maximum constraint. An associative entity is defined as an entity type that associates the instances of one or more entity types and contains attributes that are peculiar to the relationship between those entity instances. Let's start out with a relationship type example. So we see we have two entities here, the employee entity and the course entity, and they both have attributes. The employee entity has attributes listed as employee ID, and the employee ID is its identifier, employee name, and employee address. And the course entity, it has attributes listed as course ID, which is also as an identifier, and it also has attributes as course title and topic. In this relationship type, we see that many employees can complete many courses, and we see that because of these little brackets here, little brackets here. Now, in this relationship instances example, we see that we have three employees, John, Jane, and Bob. And we have three courses, Java, Python, and SQL, or SQL. In relationship instances, we see that an employee can complete one or more courses, as is the case with John completing Java and SQL, or Jane completing Java and SQL, or Bob simply completing just Python. Now, for an example of a unary relationship, we see that an employee manages many employees. In a binary relationship, we see that one employee is assigned to one office. In a ternary relationship, in this example, we see that many employees can work at many retail stores or can work at many warehouses. And in this example of the relationship cardinality, we see that with this here, we have a mandatory one, this here, mandatory many, this here, optional one, and this here, optional many. In this example, we have an associative entity. We have three entities listed with their respective attributes. We see that they are employee, certificate, and course. We can see that in this associative entity that one employee can have many certificates, or that one course can lead to many certificates. Well, that's the end. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thanks.